Welcome to part 8 of my Gatton CNC build series. In this episode, we're going to assemble, then install the Z-box on the X-axis plates. Then we'll get into a little bit of a discussion about the lead screws. Now that one needs to be trimmed a little. Okay, that one needs to be trimmed a lot. Really a lot. Now, as Dave pointed out in his build series, when it comes time to assemble the Z-box, what you're going to find on these 4 motor mount bolt holes right here is you're going to find that when you go to assemble, this top edge of the Z-box is going to interfere with these 2 motor mount holes. So what I'll need to do is I'll need to cut a recess into the motor mount right here where my 1024 T-nut is going to go. Now, in the case of the brand that I bought of 1024 T-nut, 3/4 inch Forstner bit will cut the counterbore for those front motor mount holes perfectly. Now, the head of my T-nut will sit nice and flush or down below the level of the plywood when I assemble the Z-box. Okay, assembling the Z-box itself is pretty straightforward. In fact, so straightforward I didn't even bother to shoot much of it at all. About the only things that you need to remember are to go ahead and mount all of your T-nuts here in the back of the front plate, and especially put in the T-nuts here on your motor mounts. And now you can see why it's so important to go ahead and counterbore the holes for the T-nuts down here, because as you can see, it will interfere with this front plate here. It's also important to get all this done before you assemble it, because for instance these two, it'd be impossible to do after the fact. So next step is to measure out and mark, then cut my aluminum angle for my Z-box linear rails. Now, we ended the last episode with the X-plate here mounted on the gantry. And the more observant of you may have noticed the lack of lead nut block installed on that X-plate. And there was a reason for that. I knew I was going to have to take it back off. That last episode I'm going to consider a dry run, consider it basically a mock-up, because now it's time to install the Z-box. And before I do that, I need to mount the lead nut block in place. And again, I'm going to give a serious thank you and a major nod to Andrew Hague over at the Old English Workshop, who supplied me with a couple more alignment tools that he 3D printed. Now, these are for convenience. They are, strictly speaking, not necessarily required. Now, if you watch Dave's videos, and again, you should watch all of Dave's videos repeatedly, he shows you his method for mounting the the Z-box on this X-axis plate. Well, Andrew came up with these 2 jigs that are designed to help align the bearing, align the lead nut block with the bearing here in the Z plate. And I'm going to show you how that alignment works. Now, the first and foremost, what I've done here is following the instructions on Dave's videos. I've gone ahead and I've ground down a little bit of lead screw here. Now, I have the luxury of having 3 pieces of drop-off from my Gatton shoestring budget CNC build. And this was left over from one of the axes when I built that CNC router. And it's way too long for this Z-axis. I know that. I'm going to have to cut it again. But what I did was I went ahead and used my disc sander to go ahead and grind this down to a 45-degree angle, like he did. Then I came back with a little triangular file. Don't skip that step, I'm here to tell you, because grinding on this end of the lead screw is going to goober up those threads. And you will need to go back with a little triangular file or something to clean those threads up and open up the spaces between the starts. So what I'm going to do from here is I'm going to take this alignment piece, this alignment jig here, and put it down in this end of the motor mount. Press it all the way in, and you can see it's a snug fit. It's supposed to be. And that is going to align the center of the motor mount hole with the bearing down in the end plate here. Now I'll take the lead nut, take this square piece, insert it here. Then with the flat side pointing up, I'll insert this piece of lead screw through the jigs and down into that bearing. Now, let's bring this up here so you can see it. That lead screw is clearly in that bearing. And I can feel down here, it's about halfway through the inner liner of that bearing. So, now we have that lined up. And now I'm going to take, this is being the top of my Z box, now I'm going to take the X plate, slide this all the way up here. I'm going to take the X plate and mount the bearings on the linear rails on the Z box. No, not quite. There we go. And got those. Now I'll bring it further up here, and I can see we're just a little bit loose. You can see that lead nut block rocking just a little bit. Now that tells me that if I just go ahead and screw this lead nut block here where it's supposed to be screwed, it's going to pull that lead nut block back a little ways. Now, what I have done is I've gone ahead and I've taken, now these are just some pieces of edge banding tape. It's a little bit different than the edge banding tape you're used to. That will work. This edge banding tape has no glue on it at all. It's actually designed for an edge banding machine that applies its own layer of glue. So there's no glue on this at all, but you can use the type that has glue if you prefer. And I've kind of estimated and played around here using it as a shim and cut 3 pieces, and it's taken all 3 pieces of this edge banding, stack it up right here to make up that little bit of a discrepancy there. So now I know I've got no rocking here at all. I know that now I can mount this lead nut block with these 3 pieces of edge banding material, can mount it to the Z plate, and I'll be in alignment with all 3, the lead nut block, the motor mount, and that bearing down on the bottom. Now again, as I say, this is not strictly necessary. And even if you do 3D print up these alignment jigs, you may not need to shim it. It basically boils down to thickness of plywood, how consistently thick it is, how you build your machine, the thickness of the washers, how many spacers you have in there, whether you've got a slightly bent bolt or what have you. There's a whole bunch of variables in here. You may not need to shim it up. You may need to trim that lead nut block down. Or you can go without these alignment blocks and just follow Dave's instructions as he points out on his videos. Now again, Andrew was nice enough to share these alignment jigs with me, so I'm going to make use of them. And again, I'll put a link in the description box below to where you can download a copy of the files Andrew used to make these alignment jigs, and use a 3D printer, or if maybe you have a friend who has a 3D printer, to print up a set of your own. And again, if you don't have a 3D printer or don't have access to one, I'll put a link in the description box to 3D Hubs, which is kind of an unofficial online registry of people who have a 3D printer who are more than willing to take on a job like this. So, with this knowledge, with this all shimmed up, now what I can do is I can go ahead and I can mount my lead nut block on my X plate. Then I can do the final install of my Z-Box. And I'm going to try to explain how I marked my lead screws for cutting here on the Z-Box. Now, if you look here, you'll notice I have a piece of masking tape just wrapped around, and I've already got a pencil mark drawn on that masking tape. That's where I want to cut this piece of lead screw. So the way I figured that out was, took my stepper motor and I mounted it in the spacer block that I'm using. Again, sent to me by Andrew Hague of Old English Workshop. And you see I have the coupler mounted on the motor shaft. And you probably can't make out in the video here, but the motor shaft pokes through just enough of the coupler to where it's sitting right about the halfway point right here. Now I want to cut off the lead screw to where it comes up through the coupler to right about the halfway point in this coupler as well. So what I did was mounted the coupler, then measured from the top of my Z-Box up to the center point of this coupler, right where this gap is. Now you notice this kind of hangs off the edge. That's important that you do that. Let this hang off the edge because it's going to go down inside the coupler of the motor mount here. So let that coupler hang off the edge. Then I measured from the top of the Z-Box up to the center mark of that gap in the coupler. From there, I took my engineer's scale and I spun this piece of tape around and I measured 1/2 inch up from the top of my Z-Box. Marked it, and that's where I'm going to cut my lead screw off. And that should put this end of the lead screw right in the center of that stepper motor coupler. So let me pull this out, go cut it down, and get it back in here for a test fit. Okay, with the lead screw cut to length and the coupler mounted on the top end of it, I'm going to come down here to the bottom And I'm going to put just the slightest little dab. I don't know if you can see how much is on my finger, which is way too much. Slightest little dab of white lithium grease on the end of that thread right there. Just to give it a little bit of help going through that lead nut. And that should lube it up and help prevent a lot of the binding problems. So I've got just a little bit on the end there, not a whole heck of a lot. Now I can go ahead and insert that down, catch the lead nut, and take it the rest of the way down in there. I've got my Z-box sitting on a tin can here just to kind of keep it propped up off of the bottom of the, off of the top of the table rather. And let's get her cranked down here. Get it off of that can. Make sure it's going into the bearing here. And it is. Okay. Now let me spin my coupler around to where I have access to those nuts. Then I will put my motor down on top. And there we go. I'm ready to run the screws down and fasten my motor to the top. And that's all there is to it. So with the Z-axis mounted to the X-axis, about all that's left for major construction on this build is mounting the remaining stepper motors and cutting the lead screws to fit. But that's going to be in the next video. So, if you got anything at all out of this video, please hit that thumbs up button. If you'd like to follow along with the rest of the build, consider subscribing to my channel. Now, I've put a link in the description box to a playlist that contains all the episodes to this build. I've also put a link in the description box to Dave Gatton's homepage where you can get information on a Gatton CNC of your own. Don't forget Dave Gatton's community forum. I put another link in the description to the forum. Come on over, check it out, sign up. There's some great builds going on, some great people to talk to, associate, and just talk everything CNC with. Now, whether you subscribe to my channel or not, though, I want to, again, thank you very much for watching, and y'all take care.